He thinks he can fool me.
He thought he had married into millions. He thought he had outsmarted her. But what he didn't know was that every move he made, every decision he carefully believed was his own, had already been anticipated long before he ever stepped into her world. And now, sitting inside a mansion that overlooked one of the most expensive neighborhoods in Connecticut, Daniel Carter believed he was finally in control of a life he had spent years trying to access. The documents were signed, the conversations had gone exactly as planned, and the woman beside him, Evelyn Harrington, remained calm, almost too calm, as if nothing about the situation required urgency. But what Daniel never realized was that silence is not ignorance, and observation is not weakness. Because Evelyn had already seen men like him before, men who smile with intention, who speak with precision, and who confuse access with ownership. Before we go deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Daniel Carter was not born into wealth. He came from a background where every opportunity had to be studied, every advantage had to be earned, and every connection had to be used wisely. Over time, he learned how to read people, how to identify leverage, and how to position himself in rooms where decisions were made. By the time he met Evelyn Harrington at a private fundraising event in New York, he had already built a reputation for being sharp, composed, and strategic. But what caught his attention that night was not just her presence, but her isolation within her own world. She was surrounded by influence, surrounded by people who respected her name, but emotionally, she stood alone in a way that made her difficult to read. And for Daniel, that was not a barrier. It was an opportunity. Evelyn Harrington had spent her entire life learning how to exist inside a world that constantly tried to define her by her inheritance rather than her intelligence. Her family had built generational wealth through real estate and private investments, and from a young age, she was taught that trust was not something to be given freely. It was something to be evaluated over time. She had seen relationships form quickly and collapse just as fast when money entered the equation. So when Daniel Carter approached her, not with immediate admiration for her wealth, but with controlled conversation and measured interest in her thoughts, she didn't react emotionally. She observed. Because in her experience, what people avoid talking about often reveals more than what they choose to say. Daniel did not rush the connection. He understood timing. He understood restraint. He positioned himself carefully in Evelyn's orbit, never appearing desperate, never appearing overly impressed, but always present enough to be noticed. He remembered details she mentioned in passing. He followed up on conversations weeks later. He created familiarity without forcing closeness. And over time, Evelyn began to allow his presence to feel natural, not because she trusted him, but because she had not yet identified a reason not to. Their conversations slowly became more personal, though still controlled. Daniel spoke about ambition, about building something stable, about escaping the instability of his earlier life. Evelyn listened, offering little about herself in return, revealing only what she considered safe. But what neither of them openly acknowledged was that each interaction was shaping something deeper than conversation. Daniel was studying access. Evelyn was studying intention. The proposal did not come as a surprise to anyone around them, but internally, it carried different meanings for each of them. For Daniel, it represented arrival, a confirmation that everything he had worked toward was finally aligning. For Evelyn, it represented continuation, another phase in a process she had already been preparing for without ever announcing it. When she accepted, she did so without hesitation, but also without illusion. Because in her world, acceptance was never the same as surrender. The wedding itself was private, controlled, and structured in a way that reflected legacy more than emotion. High-profile guests attended. Conversations flowed easily, and to the outside world, it appeared as though two powerful lives had merged into one stable foundation. But what no one saw was the quiet distance between understanding and assumption. Daniel believed he had stepped into a shared future. Evelyn understood that she had only allowed him access to a controlled environment. And as the days after the wedding began to unfold, Daniel started doing what he had always done best. He began studying the system he had entered. And that was the moment everything quietly began to shift. Daniel Carter believed the first few weeks of marriage were confirmation that everything was moving in the direction he had carefully envisioned. He was now inside the structure, inside the household, inside the financial conversations that once existed behind closed doors. And to him, access meant influence. Influence meant control. But what he failed to understand was that access does not always mean authority, especially in systems designed long before you arrive. Evelyn Harrington did not resist his involvement. She allowed it, calmly, quietly, without visible tension. And in Daniel's mind, that silence felt like agreement. But in reality, it was observation. Before we continue, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any upcoming stories like this. And while you're at it, leave a comment below telling us what you think is really happening in this story so far, because the truth is, most people only realize the real situation when it is already too late. Daniel's first real move came in the form of financial restructuring. He presented it as efficiency, a way to simplify overlapping accounts and streamline investment management. He spoke confidently, using terms that sounded professional, calculated, and forward-thinking. He explained how consolidating certain assets would make reporting easier, how shared access would improve decision-making, and how modern structures required flexibility rather than separation. To anyone listening casually, it sounded reasonable, even responsible. But Evelyn was not listening casually. She was listening precisely. She did not reject his suggestions. She asked questions, carefully placed questions that did not challenge his intent directly, but forced him to define it more clearly. Daniel answered without hesitation, believing he was reinforcing trust. But each answer he gave was being mapped against something he could not see. Because Evelyn was not just hearing what he said. She was measuring what he avoided saying. And then, she agreed. Not completely, not blindly, but enough for Daniel to feel a shift in momentum. Enough for him to believe that influence was beginning to tilt in his direction. That moment of agreement became the foundation of his confidence. What he didn't realize was that this was not a concession. It was calibration. As weeks passed, Daniel began to increase his involvement. He reviewed account summaries. He requested updates on property holdings. He started attending meetings with financial advisors that had long been part of Evelyn's private structure. And slowly, he began to notice something unusual. Everything was organized, but not easily accessible. Every layer he uncovered led to another layer. Every answer came with a condition. Every path forward required approval from someone other than Evelyn herself. At first, he dismissed it as standard protection for high-value assets. But over time, the pattern became harder to ignore. Nothing in Evelyn's financial world was accidental. Nothing existed without structure. And every structure had limits he could not override. Evelyn never interrupted his process. She never told him no in a way that created conflict. Instead, she allowed him to proceed exactly as far as the system would permit. And when he reached those limits, she remained calm, offering explanations that sounded reasonable but revealed nothing of true consequence. To Daniel, it felt like delay. To Evelyn, it was design. One evening, Daniel attempted to push further. He proposed adjusting ownership classifications on several properties, suggesting that joint structuring would strengthen their long-term financial position as a couple. It was a subtle step, carefully framed, designed to appear collaborative. But this time, Evelyn paused longer than usual before responding. Not in hesitation, but in consideration. And when she finally spoke, she agreed again, but with a condition Daniel did not fully examine. That condition quietly redefined the structure he thought he was building. Over the next several days, Daniel began noticing delays in execution. Requests that should have processed quickly required additional verification. Changes that once moved smoothly now triggered review stages he had not anticipated. He grew impatient, then curious, then slightly unsettled. Because nothing was being denied outright. Everything was simply delayed. And in systems like these, delay is often more revealing than denial. Evelyn, meanwhile, remained unchanged. Her routines stayed consistent. Her tone remained steady. Her presence in conversations never shifted. But her awareness had already moved ahead of Daniel's actions. She was no longer observing intent. She was observing behavior under restriction. And that distinction mattered more than anything else. Because intent can be hidden, but behavior under pressure reveals structure. Daniel did not yet realize it, But he was no longer testing the system. The system was testing him, and every step he took forward was being recorded, measured, and quietly contained. Daniel Carter did not notice the exact moment things began to change against him. That's usually how it happens when someone is convinced they are still in control. There is no alarm, no clear signal, no dramatic shift. Just small interruptions that feel explainable at first. A delay here, a clarification there, a request for verification that wasn't required before. And because Daniel had already built confidence inside the system, he interpreted each obstacle as temporary friction rather than structural resistance. But what he didn't understand was that systems like this do not resist randomly. They respond. Before we continue, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us what you think will happen next. Because in stories like this, the real turning point is usually not where people expect it to be. Daniel's approach became more direct after that. Where he once suggested, he now insisted. Where he once framed ideas as collaboration, he began framing them as necessity. He pushed for faster execution on financial restructuring, arguing that delays were inefficient for long-term planning. He referenced market conditions, asset optimization, and future stability, using language designed to sound rational rather than forceful. But underneath it all, there was urgency, not yet visible to others, but increasingly present in his own thinking. Because Daniel had started to feel something he was not used to. Resistance without confrontation. Evelyn Harrington never raised her voice. She never challenged him directly. She never created moments of open conflict that could be remembered as turning points. Instead, she allowed space. Space for him to act. Space for him to reveal intent. Space for him to escalate without interruption. And in that space, Daniel did exactly what she anticipated he would do. He pushed further. The financial structures he was trying to adjust began responding in ways he could not fully predict. Some approvals required secondary confirmation. Some transfers required extended review. Some ownership details appeared more complex than initially presented. Daniel spent hours reviewing documents, trying to locate where the complications were being introduced. But every path he followed led back to the same conclusion. Nothing was broken. Everything was functioning exactly as designed. Just not in the way he expected. That realization unsettled him more than he admitted. At home, Evelyn remained consistent. She asked fewer questions now. She offered fewer explanations. She observed more than she participated. And Daniel, without realizing it, began to fill the silence with more information than she ever requested. He started explaining his frustrations, describing delays, expressing confusion about procedural changes. He framed it as shared problem-solving. But in reality, he was revealing how deeply he had already engaged with the structure she controlled. And she listened, not to respond, but to confirm. There was a meeting with financial advisors that marked the next shift. Daniel arrived prepared, expecting to resolve what he believed were administrative obstacles. He presented adjustments, highlighted inefficiencies, and pushed for streamlined authority. But the responses he received were not resistance. They were clarification. Questions that required documentation he hadn't prioritized. Conditions tied to agreements he had not fully reviewed. References to clauses that had existed long before his involvement. For the first time, Daniel felt something close to disruption. Not because he was being stopped, but because he was being contained without acknowledgement. He left the meeting frustrated, but more importantly, uncertain. That uncertainty began to grow. He started reviewing everything again. Not just recent changes, but earlier agreements. The original documents. The foundational structures. And as he read more carefully, something began to surface that he had previously ignored. Nothing he had assumed was ever absolute. Every access point he believed he had was conditional. Every authority he thought he held was limited by terms he had not fully examined. And at the center of it all was a pattern he could no longer ignore. Evelyn was not reacting to his actions. She had already accounted for them. The realization did not come as a single moment of shock. It came as erosion. Slowly, continuously. Every assumption he revisited weakened another layer of confidence. Every document he rechecked reduced the space he thought he occupied, until eventually, he was left with a question he had avoided since the beginning. If nothing I've done created real change, then what exactly have I been doing? Evelyn noticed the shift before he spoke about it. She saw it in how he paused before responding to simple questions. in how he reviewed things twice instead of once, in how confidence had started to be replaced by calculation. And she did not interrupt it, because this stage was necessary. Awareness had to form on its own. That night, Daniel sat alone longer than usual, going through files, rereading terms, tracing approvals back to their origin. And for the first time since entering her world, he stopped seeing himself as someone building influence. Instead, he began to see himself as someone moving inside boundaries he had never defined. And boundaries, once recognized, cannot be unseen. That was the moment the illusion began to break. Not with confrontation, but with understanding. Daniel Carter did not sleep properly after that night. Not because anything had physically changed around him, but because something had changed inside him that he could not easily reverse. Once you begin to see the structure behind what you thought was freedom, you can no longer unsee it. And Daniel had started to recognize that every step he had taken inside Evelyn Harrington's world had been inside boundaries he never defined. The confidence that once carried him forward had not disappeared completely, but it had fractured. And in its place, something more dangerous had begun to form. Urgency. Before we continue, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us what you think Daniel should do next, because this is the point in the story where most people realize the situation is already deeper than it appears. Daniel's next moves were no longer careful. They were direct. He stopped asking questions and started demanding clarity. He pushed for full access to accounts he believed were partially under his control. He requested independent verification of asset structures. He began bypassing usual communication channels, reaching out directly to advisors, insisting on immediate responses. In his mind, this was correction, a way to restore balance. But in reality, it was escalation. Evelyn Harrington did not respond with resistance. She responded with procedure. And procedure, in structured systems like hers, is more powerful than refusal. Every request Daniel made triggered additional layers of verification. Every attempt to accelerate processes resulted in deeper review. Every effort to simplify created more steps instead of fewer. And slowly, what Daniel believed was inefficiency began to reveal itself as containment. He was not being blocked. He was being processed. For the first time, Daniel experienced something he had not prepared for. Not loss, not rejection, but irrelevance within a system he thought he influenced. Still, he pushed harder. There was a moment he believed would be his turning point. A financial consolidation request that, if approved, would bring several major assets under a single operational structure. He prepared it carefully, presenting it as a necessary step for stability and growth. He framed it as mutual benefit, as long-term strategy, as alignment between partners. And when he submitted it, everything appeared to move forward. At first, approvals began to process. Notifications arrived. Advisors confirmed receipt. Even preliminary confirmations suggested progress. Daniel felt it again, that return of confidence, that sense that the system was finally responding in his favor. He allowed himself to believe it was working, that he had regained momentum, that the resistance was finally clearing. But then came the pause. Not a denial, not a rejection, a suspension, a review triggered by a clause buried deep in an earlier agreement he had signed without scrutiny. A clause requiring multi-party authorization for structural consolidation above a certain threshold. A clause Daniel had seen but never truly understood. And now, that clause had activated. He tried to override it. He tried to escalate it. He tried to expedite it. But each attempt only reinforced the same response. Verification required. Authorization incomplete. Review in progress. And for the first time, Daniel realized something he had never considered before. He could not force the system to respond faster than it was designed to. Evelyn said nothing during this period. She did not interfere. She did not explain. She did not correct his assumptions. She simply continued observing as Daniel collided with the limits that had been in place long before he believed he had influence. And that silence became louder than any confrontation could have been. Daniel began reaching out more frequently, not just to advisors, but indirectly to Evelyn herself. He framed conversations around efficiency, around partnership, around trust. But underneath each sentence was the same unspoken question. Why is this happening now? Evelyn's responses remained unchanged. Calm, measured, consistent. She explained nothing beyond what was necessary. And in doing so, She gave Daniel exactly what he needed to continue discovering the truth on his own. Because the truth, once fully realized, does not require explanation. It only requires recognition. The collapse did not happen in one moment. It happened in stages. First, the realization that the consolidation would not proceed as planned. Then, the understanding that alternative routes were also restricted. Then, the awareness that even previously accessible controls were now subject to additional layers of oversight. And finally, the moment Daniel accepted what he had resisted since the beginning. He was not operating within a system he could control. He was operating within a system that had already accounted for him. Evelyn had not reacted to his actions. She had anticipated them. And everything Daniel believed he was building had already been structured to respond to his presence long before he arrived. That is what made the moment so difficult. Not betrayal, not confrontation, but design. And once Daniel understood that, everything he had been holding onto began to lose its shape. Daniel Carter's final attempt did not come from confidence anymore. It came from necessity. The kind of necessity that forms when every other option has already been tested and returned with the same result. Restricted, delayed, conditional. By this point, he was no longer trying to expand control. He was trying to prove that he still had any. And that difference changed everything about the way he moved. Before we continue, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below telling us what you think the final outcome will be, because this is the stage where everything either resolves or completely falls apart. Daniel's last move was bold, but not well received by the system he was trying to navigate. He attempted a direct financial reallocation request that would effectively reposition key assets under a structure he believed he could still influence. On paper, it looked consistent with previous approvals. It was framed correctly, documented properly, and submitted through the same channels that had worked before. But this time, the response was different. Not immediate rejection, not approval, just final review. That phrase alone changed the tone of everything that followed. Because final review, in structured systems like this, does not mean uncertainty. It means confirmation is no longer dependent on participation. It means the system is no longer adjusting to intent, but validating alignment with rules that already exist independently of the request itself. Daniel tried to escalate it. He contacted advisors. He reviewed clauses again. He attempted to identify a procedural gap he could still use. But every path led back to the same structure. One he could not bypass. One he could not negotiate. One he could not accelerate. And slowly, something began to settle in him that he had been avoiding from the beginning. There was no version of this where he regained control. Evelyn Harrington did not intervene during this phase. She did not need to. She had already done the only thing required for this moment to unfold exactly as it was now unfolding. She had built a structure that responded to behavior, not persuasion. And Daniel's behavior had already defined the outcome long before he recognized it. The final meeting between them did not feel like a confrontation. It felt like completion. Daniel entered with questions prepared, but none of them left his mouth the way he intended. Because when he saw Evelyn sitting calmly across from him, something about her presence confirmed what he had been resisting internally for some time. She was not reacting to his situation. She was observing its conclusion. He asked her directly, not with anger, but with exhaustion, when things had stopped being negotiable. Evelyn did not answer immediately, not because she was avoiding the question, but because the answer required no urgency. And when she finally spoke, her words were simple, measured, and without emotional weight. She told him things were never negotiable. They were always conditional. He simply never saw the conditions clearly enough to recognize them. That was the moment Daniel understood what had actually happened. He had not been participating in a shared system. He had been operating inside a pre-designed structure that only appeared flexible at the surface level. Every action he took had been accounted for in advance. Every assumption he made had been tested before it became a decision. Every moment he believed he was advancing had already been evaluated for outcome. And what he thought was influence had been observation. There was no anger from Evelyn, no satisfaction, no need to reinforce the outcome. Because for her, nothing about this moment required validation. The system had done what it was designed to do, and Daniel had reached the end of his permitted path within it. The financial structures remained intact. The access points he once relied on no longer responded in the same way. and the control he believed he was building had already been absorbed back into a framework that existed independently of him. What remained for Daniel was understanding, not of failure, but of position. He had not lost in a single moment. He had moved through a sequence of conditions that never belonged to him in the first place. And once that realization fully settled, there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to correct, nothing left to negotiate. Evelyn simply stood, not as a declaration of victory, but as confirmation that the process had ended exactly as intended. And then she left the room, leaving Daniel alone with the full weight of what he had finally understood too late to change. Because the most difficult truth in situations like this is not that control was taken away. It is that it was never available in the way it appeared. And once you see that clearly, you begin to question not just the outcome, but every moment that led you to believe you were ever in control at all. After everything settled, what remained was not chaos, not confrontation, but silence that carried weight. Daniel Carter did not lose everything in a single moment. He lost it in stages that only became visible when there was nothing left to recover. The financial systems he once believed were flexible had already stabilized into permanent structure. The access he once enjoyed had already been reduced to conditional visibility. And the influence he thought he had built inside Evelyn Harrington's world had already been absorbed back into systems that no longer responded to him in the same way. Before we continue, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you are watching from and what you think about how far Daniel pushed before realizing the truth, because this is where the story moves beyond personal conflict and into consequences that extend outward. In the weeks that followed, Daniel attempted to regain footing through external channels. Advisors he once worked closely with were no longer able to provide the same level of access or clarity. Certain requests required confirmations that were no longer within his reach. Even simple financial visibility had shifted into restricted oversight. And slowly, Daniel began to understand something uncomfortable. The system had not broken. It had completed its function. Evelyn Harrington, meanwhile, did not change her public behavior. She continued attending meetings, managing responsibilities, and maintaining the same composure she always had. There was no public declaration, no explanation, no attempt to define what had occurred. Because in her position, explanation was unnecessary. The structure itself had already done what it was designed to do. But what Daniel did not initially realize was that systems like this do not operate in isolation. They leave traces, patterns, records, and over time, those patterns begin to attract attention from outside observers who understand structure better than personality. At first, it was subtle. A review request from a financial compliance team. A verification notice from an advisory board. A routine audit inquiry that would normally not carry significance. But for Daniel, each of these interactions began to feel connected, not because they were coordinated against him, but because his previous actions had created visibility that now extended beyond his control. And that was the beginning of the second phase of his realization. Not that he had lost control, but that control had never been localized in the first place. Daniel began reviewing everything again. Not emotionally this time, but structurally. He went back through agreements, financial documents, approval chains, and advisory notes. And what he found this time was not confusion, but clarity that felt delayed rather than new. Every major decision he believed he had influenced was tied to a condition he had not fully understood. Every asset movement he thought he initiated was routed through frameworks that already existed independently. Every structure he believed he had helped shape had actually been designed before his involvement ever began. And the most difficult realization was not that he had been stopped. It was that he had been allowed. Allowed to move. Allowed to act. Allowed to believe progression was happening. Until the system reached the point where it no longer needed to respond in the same way. Evelyn never spoke about this phase directly, because she didn't need to. For her, the outcome was never about confrontation. It was about observation reaching completion. Daniel was not an opponent in her mind. He was a variable. And variables are not defeated. They are measured until their behavior becomes predictable enough to no longer affect the system. That was what Daniel had become. Predictable. Not in a simple way, but in a structural one. Every escalation followed a pattern. Every attempt to regain control followed timing that could be anticipated. Every decision under pressure revealed the same underlying intent. And once that level of understanding is reached, reaction is no longer necessary. Only closure. Daniel eventually stopped trying to force changes through direct systems. Instead, he attempted to rebuild from outside. Legal consultation, financial restructuring advice, independent review requests. But even those efforts began returning the same result: limitation, delay, conditional access. And slowly, something deeper set in. Not anger, not frustration, but erosion of identity. Because Daniel had always defined himself as someone who could read systems, understand leverage, and position himself advantageously. But now, every system he touched revealed the same conclusion. He was not reading the structure. He was inside it. And inside structures like that, there is a moment every person eventually reaches. The moment where effort stops being about winning and becomes about understanding why winning was never structured as an option in the first place. What Daniel Carter did not realize at first was that once a financial structure reaches a certain level of complexity, it stops belonging to the people inside it alone. It begins to exist in documentation, in oversight channels, in compliance systems that operate independently of personal intent. And once that happens, control is no longer just about access. It becomes about visibility. And visibility brings attention. Before we continue, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us what you think is really happening at this point in the story, because this is where everything stops being private and starts becoming something larger than Daniel or Evelyn alone. It started with something Daniel initially ignored: a formal request for verification tied to one of the financial entities involved in the restructuring he had attempted to influence earlier. At first, it looked routine, standard compliance, something that would be cleared quickly. But then another request followed, and another, each one referencing different parts of the same financial structure, each one asking for clarification that Daniel assumed had already been resolved internally. For the first time, Daniel was not dealing with internal systems managed by Evelyn Harrington. He was dealing with external oversight mechanisms that operated on documentation, not relationships. And that distinction changed everything. He tried to respond as he always had, carefully, strategically, providing explanations where needed, clarifying intent, emphasizing legitimacy. But what worked in personal systems did not carry the same weight here. External review does not interpret intention. It evaluates structure. And structure, once questioned, does not respond to confidence. It responds to evidence. As the inquiries increased, Daniel began to feel a shift he could not fully control. Not panic, not yet, but a tightening awareness that the situation was no longer contained within the boundaries he understood. He attempted to reach familiar advisors, but their responses were now cautious. Less direct, more procedural. The language had changed. Where once there was guidance, now there was deferral. Where once there was clarity, now there was review. And that is when Daniel realized something he had avoided acknowledging for a long time. He was no longer the central point of decision-making. He was a subject of review. Evelyn Harrington did not react to the external inquiries. She did not adjust her behavior. She did not intervene in ways that would draw attention or suggest disruption. Because from her perspective, nothing unexpected was happening. The systems that were now engaging had always been part of the broader structure. They had simply not needed to activate until now. And that was the part Daniel never fully understood. Evelyn did not build reactions. She built conditions. Conditions that only became visible when certain thresholds were crossed. The investigation phase, as it expanded, did not begin with accusation. It began with clarification requests. But clarification has a way of expanding when inconsistencies are found. One question becomes 5. 5 becomes 20. And soon, what started as administrative review begins to resemble structural analysis. Daniel found himself pulled into that process more and more. Requests for documentation he had never seen before. Historical confirmations tied to decisions he assumed were already finalized. Cross-references between entities he did not fully control. And each time he answered, he felt less like someone resolving questions and more like someone being mapped. Not for guilt, but for understanding. And that is where the shift becomes irreversible. Because once a system begins mapping behavior, it is no longer concerned with single actions. It is concerned with patterns. And Daniel's pattern, once fully visible, revealed something he had never been forced to confront before. Consistency under assumption. Escalation under uncertainty. and dependence on systems that were never truly under his authority. Meanwhile, Evelyn remained unchanged in appearance, tone, and public presence. But internally, her awareness of the situation was already complete. She was no longer anticipating outcomes. She was observing final confirmation, because everything that was now unfolding externally had already been accounted for in earlier structural decisions. And this is what separated perception from design. Daniel believed the situation was unfolding around him. Evelyn had already designed how it would unfold before it reached him. The final stage of the external review did not come with confrontation. It came with conclusion reports, summaries, findings, structured documentation that outlined how various components of the financial system interacted, where inconsistencies appeared, and how certain assumptions had led to structural misalignment in execution. And within those findings, Daniel saw something that unsettled him more than anything else. Not wrongdoing, not exposure, but traceability. Every action led somewhere. Every decision connected to a condition. Every path he thought he created had origin points that did not begin with him. That was the moment Daniel stopped trying to defend his position, because there was nothing left to defend, only something left to understand. And understanding, once fully formed, does not require agreement. It only requires acceptance. And as this realization settles, the story stops being about control. It becomes about how easily control can feel real when you are only seeing the portion of the system that allows you to move freely. By the time Daniel Carter reached what could be called the final stage of understanding, there was no longer anything he could actively change. Not because he was physically stopped, and not because someone directly intervened against him, but because every pathway he once believed was open had already resolved itself into outcomes that were no longer reversible in the way he expected. Before we continue, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us what you think the final truth is at this point in the story, because this is where everything that felt uncertain finally becomes clear. Daniel stopped receiving new opportunities to adjust or respond in meaningful ways. The system had moved beyond engagement. What remained was confirmation, documentation, finalized structures. Every financial and legal layer that had once felt like it was still in motion had settled into its completed state. And that realization did not arrive as a sudden shock. It arrived as silence. Not external silence. Internal. The kind that forms when effort no longer produces variation. For Daniel, the hardest part was not the loss itself. It was the recognition that there was no single moment where things went wrong. There was no mistake he could isolate, no decision he could reverse, no conversation he could point to as the turning point. Instead, what he found was continuity. Every step had followed logically from the last. Every outcome had been consistent with the conditions already in place. And that meant something more uncomfortable than failure. It meant design. Evelyn Harrington, in contrast, did not experience any shift in her daily life that could be described as disruption. Her routines remained structured. Her interactions remained measured. Her decisions remained forward-facing. Because from her position, nothing had deviated from expectation. The entire sequence had unfolded exactly within the parameters it was always capable of producing. She had never needed to intervene at the point of escalation. Because escalation had already been accounted for long before it appeared, Daniel eventually requested one final clarification meeting, not to challenge outcomes, and not to reverse anything, but to understand how far back the structure had been defined. That question, more than anything else, revealed the final layer of the situation. Because what he wanted to know was not what happened. It was when it stopped being flexible. And the answer, when it came indirectly through documentation review and structured explanation, pointed not to a recent phase, but to the beginning. The early meetings, the carefully timed introductions, the controlled progression of trust, the consistency of access without resistance. Even the moments that felt like Daniel was gaining influence had all aligned within a framework that did not require his awareness to function. And once he saw that clearly, the narrative he had built around himself began to lose its structure. Not all at once, but permanently. Evelyn never described this in emotional terms. She never framed it as victory, loss, or even confrontation. Because from her perspective, it had never been any of those things. It had been observation of behavior within a controlled environment until that behavior naturally reached its limit. And when that limit was reached, the system no longer needed engagement. only completion. Daniel's final understanding did not come with confrontation, and it did not come with closure in the way people often expect from stories like this. It came with recognition that control is not always taken away in dramatic moments. Sometimes it is simply revealed to have never been distributed the way it appeared. And once that realization forms fully, it does not leave room for argument, only reflection. In the end, nothing about Evelyn's life appeared disrupted, and nothing about Daniel's situation required further explanation, because everything that needed to be understood had already been built into the structure long before either of them recognized its full shape. And that is where the story ends. Not with a fight, not with revenge, but with the understanding that most outcomes are not decided at the end. They are simply revealed there. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like this video, leave a comment telling us what you think really happened behind the scenes, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss our video.